All right, we can start. Okay, so how are we all doing? So we're going to finish up just with a little bit with urban sprawl, and then we're going to get into reviewing for the exam. And by the way, the exam's been open. You have until Friday evening, I think at midnight, to take it. And I might also mention we do have tutoring. I don't know. I think there's still time if you want to try and get a tutoring session with one of the tutors. We have one here and also one at the Sutter Center, Deborah, and people always seem to do better when they do some tutoring, so I recommend it. All right, so just finishing up with urban sprawl. I just wanted to finish up with the problems caused by sprawl that can no longer keep sprawling. We've talked about, for example, housing problems, people not living where the good work is. We talked a little bit about, the guys that have the skills the jobs want are the guys that tend to live far away. And so all of that was meant to show that there's a lot of traffic congestion. Well, all of that was building to this next problem, which is traffic congestion and pollution. That's the real consequence of sprawl. When you spread everything out so horizontally, and your housing is one place, your work is another place, your entertainment's another place, your shopping's another place, that leads to lots of driving. And when there's lots of driving, there's lots of pollution. And so there's a number of things we could mention here about it. I don't know if I should read you some of the statistics about it. Maybe I started to talk about that the other day. But people are there's basically double the number of, so vehicle miles traveled is doubled since the 1980s. Vehicle miles traveled is a measurement of all the driving. So if you take all the Angelenos and all their driving in a year, that is vehicle miles traveled. But how much of that time is spent actually getting anywhere? A lot of it has to do with increased idling time. So people are driving more. Remember we mentioned the, well actually it more than doubled, I should have said more than doubled. The population doubled, but the VMT more than doubled. And so that was another indication that it's more than just more people on the road causing more traffic. It's more people driving further distances all the time to do what they're doing, having to get in the car for almost everything. And if you have that many cars on the road, people aren't necessarily going anywhere because there's so much traffic. And so another thing to ask is, how much time are you actually just sitting in your car without going anywhere? That's called idling. And idling is really bad for the environment if you understand how engines work, and I don't, but the idling of engines creates more smog, creates more of the carbon monoxide and other chemicals that become smog. And so when cars are just sitting there with their engines on, that's the worst for the air. And so somebody did a study, the LA Times did a study asking, how much, so they gave people stopwatches. And they said, every time you're in your car, stop, like at a stoplight, press the stopwatch and just measure how much time that is. Then stop it once you start going. And then next time you stop, add one of those additive stopwatches. And they did this with a sample of people. I think they took 1,000 people and said, measure your stop time for a month. And then they took an average and they figured out like how much time do people spend just sitting in their car, not going anywhere. And it came out to about 160 hours a year. If you drive like a typical Angelino, then 160 hours of your year will be spent just sitting in your car, not going anywhere. And 160 hours, that's a full month of work. That's the equivalent of that. No one's paying you to do that. In fact, you're losing money because you're burning gas and time doing that, and you're creating all this smog. And so smog is a big problem in LA. They used to have these things called stage 1 smog alerts. I think I started to talk a little bit about this the other day. The stage 1 smog alert is when the air is so bad that kids have to stay home from school. They basically close the schools because kids can't breathe without damaging their lungs. And back in the 1970s and late 70s, when I was in school, there was one year where there was something like 300 smog alerts that year. That doesn't mean that 300 days out of the year, all the Angelino kids got to stay home, but it means that in different districts or different schools throughout the area, there was 300 times that a school had to close because of smog. Now, in recent decades, that's gotten much worse. Much better. The good news is that there's so I'm not going to write down the figures or read them, but let's say in 1978 there was like 300. In 1998 there was like 20. So that's really good news that the stage 1 smog alerts have gone down, as I think we answered the other day. Why is that? It's California's smog law. You have to have a catalytic converter on your engine, and you have to go test it. You have to prove that your car actually is collecting those chemicals. That's what a catalytic converter does. Instead of putting those smog chemicals in the air, it converts them into some other less harmful chemical. And yeah, it makes our gas costs more in California. We have special cleaner gas in California, so people complain about California, and some people go, I'm moving to Texas, gas is cheaper. But California has been trying to address the problem of smog and bad air. And LA, California, used to be the smog capital of the country. Now Texas is. Houston is the smog capital. And so that's good news. I'm sharing that because one of the problems with the whole global warming issue is people have given up hope. They're like, what can we do? There's nothing we can do. But there's lots of, as I mentioned, with the ozone hole and with the Clean Air Act of the United States, the air in the United States is actually much cleaner than it used to be. There were times in American history when in cities you couldn't even see anything. And it's like that in China nowadays, by the way. In some cities in China, the dust and the smog and the pollution makes it so you can barely see or breathe. And they don't have Clean Air Act there. They're not a democratic country where the people themselves said, hey, we want clean air and we want to make sure our businesses and our cars are not polluting our air. So I'm again trying to show you government sometimes is a good thing. When people demand as a people, we want clean air, let's come together and figure out with our laws how to get that. That's what we did in the United States. And that's one of the problems with globalization. If we keep sending our production to countries that don't have that, we're just making the world dirtier while our air is maybe staying clean, but not for long, because nowadays we're breathing Chinese air. That's what some measurements show. A lot of the stuff blows over the Pacific Ocean, so their pollution becomes our pollution. And that really ties in with the next issue, which is what's called the locus of smog. So that's a fancy way of saying, where does the smog collect? Smog it all comes up from all the cars and all the other things burning fossil fuels, and it ends up in the air, and then as the air gets colder at night, it concentrates, and it tends to settle over one particular area of the city. As I mentioned earlier, the downtown area of LA, the oldest part of this whole megalopolis area that we're talking about, that used to be where everybody came to go to work. Back in the days before Sprawl, when production was concentrated in the downtown of LA, in the core of LA. Now we have these edge cities all around LA, Irvine and Santa Clarita and all the places where the new jobs and the new shopping and the new big box stores are. And so people are driving out to those things. And the locus of smog, where the smog ends up being, is now different. It now settles over Glendale, which is more inland, more towards the hills and the mountains. And that's where a lot of work is. That's where Burbank and Glendale is where a lot of the movie production happens now. It doesn't happen down in Hollywood. It happens out there in Burbank and Glendale, and that's where a lot of other industry is. So what does that mean? We mentioned the throat cancer and asthma and other things that were hitting low-income, poor, immigrant, brown people when the locus of smog was over the city of LA. Now that it's over the more of the whiter suburban areas of LA, now people are like, well, maybe smog's a problem. In other words, this question of who decides whether a city has a problem and whether anything needs to be done about it. When it was poor people and their kids getting harmed by smog, the city's like, oh, that's fine. We don't need better public transportation. We don't need to think about smog. But now that richer people are breathing that air and seeing the problems with it, they're starting to say, maybe we need to do something about the smog problem and about how we organize transportation and housing in the LA area. So it's a lesson there a little bit in how power works. I mean, if power is concentrated among particular groups and their lifestyle, like we said, a lot of the rich people in LA live in the hills. They live in the hilly areas around LA. They rarely see smog, or traditionally they didn't. And now they're seeing it and feeling it and tasting it and breathing it. And so now people see it as a problem. In the same way, global warming, maybe people were saying it's not a problem, I don't care about it, doesn't bother me. But now, for example, in California, it's hard to get your house insured. And the whole insurance industry is saying, well, we can't afford global warming. Once rich companies start admitting this is a problem and we can't deal with it, then maybe the world starts to say, hey, let's do something about this. But what can we do about all of this? So I really wanted to get into the solutions. So what are the solutions to all the things I'm talking about? And the basic idea I want to get across here is what's known as smart growth principles. So LA grew the way it did because it wasn't planned. It wasn't smart. It just happened in a way. As we mentioned, it was done for greed, out of profit. So people pursued short-term gain. Oh, I can make a bunch of money if I build this right now. But then when a bunch of people do that, you end up with a bunch of stuff getting built, and then you look at it and go, well, what have we built now? What is this overall thing? It's this big megalopolis that's hard to live in, that has smog problems, traffic problems, housing problems, work problems, all kinds of problems. So it might be a good idea when you're looking at a place like the Sacramento Valley, as we look through this valley here, do we want to end up like the valleys of Los Angeles, or do we want to try and be a little more planful and smart about thinking about what kind of future do we want for this valley, and how do we get there? Luckily, Sacramento has something that LA traditionally didn't. It's called the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, SACOG. And they have something called the Smart Growth Blueprint. The basic idea here is regional thinking and regional planning. So instead of just thinking small, like each city doing its own thing, each city like Marysville, just let's do what's best for Marysville. Yuba City, let's just do what's best for Yuba City. Lincoln, let's just do what's best for Lincoln. Rockland, we don't care about Lincoln, we're going to do what Rockland wants. That sort of small scale thinking, each city doing its own thing, that's how LA ended up the way it did. And so the new smart growth is to say, let's realize that we're part of a larger region here. People share areas like farmland and forests and rivers and lakes and stuff. And so if we're going to share it somehow, we've got to work together as a whole region, not just as each city doing its own thing. And if each city, but the problem is that we don't have a government. We don't have a regional government. Each city has a government, each county has a government, but you don't have a thing called the Los Angeles Area, authority. You have a bunch of little ones that compete against each other, and they fight over things. I mentioned governance problems, like whose problem is the smog? If it's settling over Glendale, is it Glendale's problem? But Glendale will say, but it's all you guys driving over to Glendale from downtown LA. So because the county won't build more housing over here, that we're facing the problem over here. So they fight over whose problem it is. Crime is a similar one too, you know, O.J. Simpson just died. There was the famous case of O.J. Simpson and his slow speed chase through LA. You get a lot of chases through LA because there's so many freeways that's where criminals end up, is on the freeway. And then how do you catch a guy on a freeway? Well, when he's going through Glendale, the Glendale police try to catch him. And then when he's going through Rancho Cordova, you know, whatever, then those people try to catch him. And so they're fighting over who gets to have the arrest. Which cops get to say, we caught the guy. Instead of just working together as regional law enforcement to make the citizens safe. A similar issue with gangs, like whose problem is the gang problem? San Fernando Valley is mostly white, and a lot of those people said, those gangs down in LA, those aren't our kids, so we don't want to pay for cops. But then the people in downtown LA said, well, you're lucky you don't have gangs in your area, that's because of the sprawl. All the rich housing is over there, all the rich, expensive houses, and we're out here dealing with apartments and poverty. And so you're lucky you're protected from the gangs. They're not in your neighborhood, good for you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't pay for cops. We need cops down here. So again, if you thought regionally about it, you'd be like, there is a gang problem in my region. And it's over there, luckily my kids don't see it, but since it's in my region, I should have to pay taxes to deal with it. But a lot of people don't see it that way. They're like, well, I live over here and the gangs are over there, so why am I paying? So it's a tax issue again, you know, and you guys are young, but as you get to be adults, you'll start maybe asking more, or older adults, more questions about where's my money going and who's spending it and why. But if you think with regional consciousness about issues, maybe you'll feel better about how things are done. SACOG is really working together and saying to all these counties and cities, so it's a partnership of 5 cities, or 5 counties, or more, I think 6 counties. So if you think of the counties in this region, Yolo County, Placer County, Sutter County, Sacramento County, Yuba County, El Dorado County. Now we're talking about, places that can work together. And so what are the smart growth principles? So what SACOG says is we want to make sure that all these cities and counties agree, that's what this blueprint is, we agree in principle to the idea that we're going to try to not become LA, that we're going to try to be smart about how we grow things in this valley. And so there's no real teeth in it. Again, the governments have enforcement mechanisms to tell cities or whatever, you're wrong, you're not doing things right. SACOG doesn't really have that, so they can say to Yuba County, which they do, join us, be part of SACOG, we'll make sure that this region's development helps you too. For example, Marysville and Yuba City would love to have more tourists from Sacramento. We're having a play, I'm putting on a play later in June. We would love if people from Sacramento came up to see the play. I don't think people right now generally think of, coming to Yuba City for that kind of stuff. But that's the kind of thing. So city leaders of Yuba City and Marysville do realize, at least the ones I know, that joining together with SACOG and leaders of other communities and cities in the area, in the long run helps you achieve the kind of community that you want to be part of, where you don't have smog and you don't have crime and you don't have traffic and all those things. And so what are smart growth principles? Well, first is compact development, which is basically saying don't sprawl out. In other words, instead of building things outwards horizontally, you try to keep things close together. That means things like building things together, so things like mixed use development. The way LA grew is like I said, it was developer driven, but developers tend to specialize in different things. Like I might be a developer that specializes in shopping malls, and you might be a developer that specializes in building big housing communities with a lot of houses in it. And so one developer says, I'm going to put a big shopping mall over here. And then another developer says, I'm going to put a big housing development over here. And another one says, I'm going to put a big entertainment complex over here. Well, now you have those things, but they're all spread out. those are single-use developments, just a shopping mall, just housing. Mixed-use development is trying to say, when we develop housing, for example, let's make sure that housing has office buildings right next to it, so that there's jobs right there too. And let's make sure there's entertainment options, so that people don't have to get in their car and drive far away from the housing to be able to go find some entertainment. And there's eating options, restaurants and things like that. So the new model of smart growth is, these more master planned communities. When I came up to first live in this area, I didn't know what was up here. We were living in Southern California, and all I could do was look at the internet and see what was up here. And we weren't sure what was going on in Marysville and places like that. So Lincoln looked attractive, and Lincoln said they had these things called master planned communities, like Lincoln Crossing and 12 Bridges. And if you go to those places, you'll see it's a big housing development, but in the center of the housing development is a big shopping mall, basically, with the Target and Home Depot and all the kind of restaurants and grocery. So the idea is it's walkable. It's a kind of walkable community. You can live in those houses in Lincoln Crossing, but you never have to get in your car necessarily, especially if you have small children. You can, put your kids in the carriage, and go over to the Target and get your shopping done and walk around, get your exercise, walk back. And so it's a new model of lifestyle that's meant to be, in a way, going back to how things used to be. You can kind of see the difference between compact development and sprawl right here in Marysville. If you think of downtown Marysville, was built before cars. It was built at a time of horses and carriages and people walking. And so the streets are pretty narrow. The shopping's all right next to each other. You can easily imagine, if times were different, going down to downtown Marysville and spending a whole day walking around, walk to the movies, walk to some gallery, walk to some shopping, go to a restaurant. But then compare that to North Beale Road. North Beale Road was built and developed in the period that LA suburbanization happened, when all these new housing, single-family homes got developed. And they developed it along what's called a strip. This North Beale Road is a strip, and a drag strip, some people call it, but along a strip are what are called strip malls. So we have all along North Beale Road here, these shopping centers that the first thing you see is the parking lot, and the shopping center is set way back from the road. So that's a problem in a lot of ways. For one thing, it means they're in darkness, and those strip malls get used to, or I think still, get hit all the time by criminals because they're easy targets, because they're away from the road, away from the sidewalk. And for a long time, North Beale Road didn't even have any sidewalks. It wasn't meant to be a road that you'd ever walk on. And if you did try to walk on it, you'd probably get hit by a car, and a lot of people did, because the intersections are too far apart to walk safely from one sidewalk to the other. So North Beale Road, they've been trying in recent years to follow smart growth principles. So one thing they did was put a median through North Beale Road, so you could actually walk from one side to the median and wait, and then walk to the other. They did a lot of things with pointing out where the crosswalks are, because it used to be all the crosswalks have is a little sign with a walk, and people get hit all the time. So they had to do a lot of things to try and get you to notice that there are pedestrians here and they might be crossing and you don't want to hit them. They also planted a lot more trees. Another thing is LA has very few trees. In the old days, they thought palm trees were the cool thing to plant, and they planted lots of them. But palm trees drink a lot of water and they don't give you any shade. So if you're wondering why they have global warming problems in LA and smog problems and heat problems, trees provide shade, they provide oxygen, they drink up the carbon dioxide, or they breathe in the carbon dioxide that the cars are putting out, and then they put out oxygen. So if you have a lot more trees in your city, that's a lot healthier for everybody, and people spend a lot less on air conditioning and things, and even heating, because trees heat you up or insulate you during the wintertime, and they insulate you during the summertime, so they help keep your city cooler. Sacramento, I noticed, if you ever go on a really hot day to the city of Sacramento, it's a little cooler than everywhere else around it because there's so many darn trees in Sacramento, and they call themselves the city of trees. And so here on Northfield Road, which for a long time was pretty bare of any trees of any kind, they plant more trees to make it more shaded. So one day, hopefully Northfield Road would be a very nice looking road with tall trees shading it with a nice median in between, and hopefully a bunch of thriving businesses along it. Another thing, but see here, they're trying to do more mixed use. So one thing we don't have in this area is a lot of you live very far away from this school, and you all said you drove here to get here. It would be a smarter growth idea around here to have, so they built like Edgewater, the new housing. And Edgewater is mainly for people who can afford their own home. Students generally can't. So what you didn't do was really make it possible for students to live near Yuba College. And so building more apartments, so like across the street from Yuba College is a big, huge vacant lot. It might make sense to build some apartments there, some little retail stuff like Starbucks and other things. If you have an area there where students could live, they could shop, they could recreate, they could study, you would be creating more of a lively community around here instead of everybody just leaving to go home. That would probably reduce crime, because if you have more students and up and coming people that are driven and trying to make something of themselves in this community, that would be a nice counterbalance to people who are, addicted and things like that. So it just makes sense to do that kind of mixed use. What that relates to is something called infill development. LA and this area have a lot of what are called missing teeth. If you look up and down Northfield Road, there are vacant lots. Lots that used to have something on them, but now have nothing on them. And some of the people on Northfield Road also have missing teeth, but we'll talk about them. But the point is what was there? You have in a lot of cities what are known as brownfields. There are areas of land that you can't build on because they're contaminated. For example, if there was a gas station on a piece of land and they had tanks, gas tanks and oil tanks under the ground, it's very common and almost inevitable that those tanks leached chemicals into the dirt. And so there's still toxic chemicals in the ground there, and you're not allowed by law to build on there, because then all the people living there or working there will be breathing toxic chemicals the whole time. So in order to build there, you have to do what's called remediation. You have to clean it up. You have to dig out the dirt that's contaminated and get rid of it. And most companies don't want to do that. They'd rather, that's one reason sprawl happens. They'd rather buy fresh farmland that's never been built on and build on that than buy contaminated land that's sitting in the middle of your city. But we have these brownfields, and we have other just land that was abandoned or had stuff on it or just isn't desirable. But cities are smart to figure out, how do we encourage developers to go in and redevelop these brownfields or these infill areas, to fill it in with something. Sacramento's big infill issue is what are called the rail yards. There's this whole area as you drive in on 5 into the city of Sacramento, and you look to the left, you'll see big, huge open area with big old railroad buildings. And they want to develop that area, but it's a brownfield and it's got contamination. And a big question is, whose contamination is it? Southern Pacific Railroad was there for decades, and it's their pollution, but they claim to not have the ability to clean it up. So the federal government does have money to help cities clean up its brownfields so that they can develop, but it's it can be a long legal battle over whose problem is it, who caused it, who should get the money. But Sacramento's been trying for a long time to figure out, how can we develop the rail yards into something that would look more like a mixed-use, walkable development. They started to do that, but it's not quite there yet. But eventually they want to have maybe the Sacramento Republic soccer team stadium down there. And so you have a stadium, you have housing near the stadium, you have shopping near the stadium, and you have a whole new area that's a fun place to live, because you don't have to get in your car and you get to go do fun stuff and have good jobs and stuff like that. So that's kind of another So that's a smart growth principle, is so the opposite of it is leapfrog, not leapfrog development. Leapfrog development is jumping over an undesirable area and building further away. Plumas Lake, I have to admit, is leapfrog development. Have you been to Plumas Lake? They shouldn't have ever built Plumas Lake. I own a house there, so I'm being a hypocrite right now. But again, that was developer driven. So developers were like, well, there's a bunch of farmland out there that's cheap, and if we build a bunch of houses out there that are, $500,000, $200,000 houses, people will buy them. And they're right about that, but there's no shopping out there. There's no work out there. So if you live in Plumas Lake, you have to get in your car to really go do anything. They have, now that they've reached a certain density, a certain number of what they call rooftops, once enough of the houses get actually built and you have actually people living in them, then you can start bringing in the retail. So a few more gas stations have been built in Plumas Lake since the time that I was there. But that place too has big empty fields that were planned to be retail and work and stuff like that. So eventually they hope Plumas Lake would become more of a self-sustaining community where everything you need is in that community. But right now it's not there. I do happen to know that the county supervisor for that is in that area, Bradford. He's a Yuba County supervisor, but that's his district. And he likes SACOG, and he is interested in how do we pursue more smart growth. So one big issue for him is it would be really cool if you had light rail, public transportation going from Plumas Lake to Sacramento so that you didn't have to get in your car. You could be living in Plumas Lake, jump in the light rail, go see a Sac Republic game or a Kings game, or go shopping in Sacramento and hop back on the light rail and get back to your community. And so that's a smart growth principle called transit-oriented development. In other words, when you build housing, try to build it near where there is public transit. Transit-oriented development. And if you can build up the development around where the train station is, you have shopping there, you have jobs there, you have housing there, you make it a thriving area. And you keep it compact, instead of just having everybody living on more and more farmland and in single family homes. Eventually we wouldn't have any farmland, and that won't be good. And, so I'm trying to remember the other smart growth principles that I am holding you responsible for. Let me just check something here. I guess the only other smart growth principle I haven't really mentioned is regional cooperation, but that's what I was talking about with SACOG. But that's a principle, is that people need to cooperate in the region, not be like LA where they're fighting over whose problem is whose problem and then not solving them. The smart growth says, let's recognize that we're all part of one big megalopolis or one big region and try to figure out how to make it a livable region so that we don't have smog problems in the Sacramento Valley, so that we still have farmland in the Sacramento Valley, so that we still have freshwater places to go and lakes and wetlands and stuff like that. There is yet another battle too. I don't have much to say about it. I don't know about it, but again, it has to do with groundwater. So farmers up here pumped a lot of groundwater for their crops, and that caused problems because then the land starts sinking and stuff like that. And so there's a big issue in California over who has the right to pump groundwater, who has water rights in the rivers and lakes and stuff like that. And there's going to be more and more battles going forward over water. But smart growth is partly about that, about figuring out how to use as little water as possible. That's another thing I would mention is drought-tolerant landscapes or green growth. So things like, drought-tolerant landscapes. You can't just keep building with the single-family homes. Everybody wants their own lawn. And everybody has a lawn, and then everybody's spending lots of water keeping their lawn green. But why do you really need a lawn? I mean, that's like just a tradition that comes from English times. But really in California, the idea that everybody needs a green lawn doesn't really fit with the California climate. California is more of an arid, almost in a lot of places close to desert. And so having a lot of green lawns doesn't work. And golf courses are another big suck on water and stuff like that. And there again, you know, the rich, wealthier people didn't see it as a problem until it became one. But so drought tolerant means using things like more native plants instead of bringing in Bermuda grass from Bermuda, which has a lot of rain, and planting Bermuda grass in your yard. You know, maybe planting some native grasses and native plants that don't need a lot of extra water because they're adapted to this climate and can deal with the low rainfall and things like that. And so that's another, you know, green growth, and planting more trees is another helpful thing that makes it so that you don't have to use as much other kinds of energy to keep yourself cool and air clean and all those things. So I think that gives you a pretty good introduction to the idea that you know, we can make better choices as a society about things and thereby avoid problems like smog and global warming and all the problems that come with those things. And so I'm hopeful, I try to remain hopeful, that planet Earth itself will figure out a way to come together regionally, the whole region being planet Earth, to figure out how are we going to solve problems like global warming and how are we going to reorganize things so that we're not having to create so much. So like the whole globalization thing, having a lot of our things that we buy being made in China and then brought over on big, huge boats so we can consume it here, you know, maybe that's something we want to rethink, and maybe having more local production of things so that we're not using a lot of fossil fuels to carry things long distances. And there's a lot of other principles that if you care about this issue, you can learn more about it, and I encourage you to do so. I think your future, you know, if being sociological means thinking about history, where you fit in history, it also is about thinking what does your future hold? And so if you understand the history of this country and the history of cities like LA and Sacramento, then this question of the environment and how we're treating it and how we can make better choices about how we treat it, I think those are going to be big issues for you guys going forward. Luckily, I die soon, but you guys, I'm just kidding. No, but it is the problem for today's generation. And that's another issue I might point out is a lot of the people running things aren't as concerned because we're not going to experience it. And so, you know, I feel like the time is ripe for another kind of uprising by the young against the older people who seem to be just letting the world get worse and worse rather than being smart about fixing things. All right, well, I will stop there with my presentation of sociology. Now we can move on to reviewing what we presented about sociology. So any questions or thoughts or comments about anything today so far? I'm sure you're concerned about the bottom line, as we've talked about your grades. And so more important than learning about mixed use development, you want to learn about what's on the test. So I don't blame you, but again, that's something I wish weren't the case. I wish we could care about what we're learning more than what we're going to be graded on. But let me bring up my review guide. All right. All right, so here's our review guide. I hope you've already downloaded that, or I think I did give you a link to it in an announcement. If it's the first time you're seeing it, you're a little bit behind on things. Now, luckily, these first two questions, what is tautological and what is falsifiable, we didn't cover those in here. So I'm not gonna hold you responsible for those, so you can ignore those, but those are very interesting ideas. I didn't talk about those, did I? Tautology and falsifiability. Anyone remember me ever talking about those? No, it's usually when we talk about the research process. Let me just, because I think it's useful for me to know, so let me just quickly go to you. So, I mean, when you're trying to say that X causes Y, you don't want to make these logical errors. And tautology is when you mix up X and Y, and you say, like, if you say something like, you know, what causes good grades? And you say, well, being smart causes good grades. Is it true that being smart causes good grades? Maybe. But what do you mean by smart? Then the question means, how do you measure it? How do you measure smart? And what if you said, well, smart, I'm going to measure smart by looking at GPA, at your grade point average. So then I would be trying to see, do people who have good grades get good grades? And that would be tautological. You wouldn't be saying anything, you'd just be talking in a circle. Falsifiable is the question of, can you measure it or not? And really in science, this is what I think is interesting about falsifiability. We're not trying to prove things are true. You really can't prove anything is true, because who knows what could happen tomorrow. If I tell you, I know it's true that capitalism leads to, you know, revolution. Well, how do you know that's true? I mean, maybe you're wrong about that. What you can do, though, is prove things wrong. If people say something's true and you find evidence that proves that it's wrong, then you've really done something important. And so really science isn't really about proving things true, it's about proving things are false. But the only way to prove something's false is if you can measure it. And a lot of times people say things that can't be measured. So if you say something like God created the universe, I can't prove you wrong. Why? Because I can't measure God. God's an unmeasurable idea. So I can't prove God didn't create the universe. Maybe he did, or she did, or it did. It's not a measurable concept. On the other hand, if I say that the Big Bang created the universe, that is measurable. And so anyway, so science is about looking at things that we can measure and seeing if our guesses about measurement are true or not. But we can't deal with things that aren't measurable, like God, or opinions. If I say something like, I think the United States is better than Russia, can I prove that? Well, no, because better is a thing that we'll disagree on. You might think something's better and other people think it's worse, and so it's a subjective opinion. It can't be measured objectively from how you feel. So those kinds of subjective thoughts and feelings aren't measurable outside of the person themselves, so a scientist can't prove it's not true. I can't prove you don't think Russia's great. I don't think it's great, but if that's what you think, it's your own opinion. And so subjective opinions, statements of faith, these are things that can't be falsified. They can't be proven wrong, and therefore they're not scientific. Scientific statements are ones that can be proven wrong. Anyway, but everything else on here is fair game. Oh, and actually, I just realized this doesn't even have all the questions on it. I'm looking at the wrong one. This was one I made for a class that didn't get, it only got through education. It doesn't have the questions about carbon footprints. So let's see. Is that the one I gave you guys? I think I gave you another one. Yeah, this one is more complete, and I think this was the one I linked to. And so, yeah, so this one, as you see, didn't just stop at impact. No, it has these questions too. So, have you looked at it? Are there questions you want me to cover and go over, or how would you like me to proceed here? Did you guys get a chance to study it? No? Yeah.
Can we go over Kuntz?
Kuntz, okay. Yeah, let's go over Kuntz. There's a bunch of questions about Kuntz. And in fact, if you understand some of these ideas about Kuntz, you will help you with the other questions on here. So, yeah, so questions 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 are all Kuntz questions. So let's kind of focus on that. So we started this whole section of our material with the question of how do we know if X causes Y? We use that as the sort of basis of science. That's what science can do better than other ways of thinking, is trying to figure out what causes what to happen. And so we started with that example of, does marijuana use cause you to get better grades? And we said, well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't cause that. So how do we explain the correlation? So we started with this idea that correlation is not causation. Just because two things seem to go together doesn't mean they necessarily do, or that one is causing the other. And so what we've spent a lot of time thinking about is intervening variables, things that could have happened after X but before Y. And we talked a lot about antecedent variables, things that happened before X happened, that also caused Y to happen. And so we did that with marijuana use and grades. We said if it isn't smoking marijuana that causes higher grades, even though that correlation was observed, a study found that exact thing. But it would be non-scientific to just conclude on that basis that yes, if I smoke pot, my grades will go up. A scientist has to think rigorously, like I said, logically. Logically, if you see this correlation, you can say to yourself, is it necessarily the case that X is the thing causing the grades? Just because they go together. There could be something else after you smoke pot or don't, something else that people do that explains their grades. There could also be something people do before they ever came to college that explains why they get to smoke pot and why they get good grades. So logically, you can think of other reasons why somebody would be getting good grades, and it might not just be this pot smoking. And that kind of logical, critical thinking is what I've been emphasizing through this unit. Kuntz, what was her research question? She wanted to see, does divorce cause emotional and school problems for kids? She wants to see if these things are correlated, but not just correlated, but that if you can really isolate divorce as the variable, she wants to see, is divorce the independent variable that causes emotional and school problems for kids? In other words, so I won't spend a lot of time going into how she studied the question, but she didn't collect her own data. She got a bunch of data that already exists. A bunch of studies have already been done on this question. Some studies find a strong connection between divorce and emotional school problems. Some studies find no connection. So how do you go about deciding as a scientist what the answer is? How you should look at this? Well, she combined all the studies. She did a meta study. So what if we combine all these different studies into one set of data? And then we'll have a huge amount of data to answer this question. Some of the data, though, were flawed. Flawed data came from clinical studies. Flawed data, what we really mean is it's biased data. And the clinical studies are biased because they're tilted. Well, what bias means is tilted. And I want you to understand the logic of what's called sampling strategy. So sampling strategy is about how am I going to study my research population. There's this big group of people you want to understand better, but you can't study all of them. Almost never can we study our whole research population. We always have to get a sample, a smaller version of that thing. And a sampling strategy should be one that gives everybody in your research population an equal chance to get into your sample. Equal chance. Your sample will be biased or tilted if you're giving certain people more chance to be in your study than other people. Certain people that share certain characteristics, and you're leaving out some other people that share certain characteristics. If everybody has an equal chance to get in, then you should have the right number of people with different characteristics in your group. Like if I'm only asking left-handed people to be in my sample, then I won't have any right-handed people, and it'll be a tilted, a biased sample. Well, these studies, clinical studies, were biased because they only looked at people in treatment. People getting treatment. The research population for studying whether divorce harms people is everyone. There's some people with divorced parents and some people without divorced parents. And if you're trying to figure out whether the people with divorced parents have more problems, then your whole group is everybody. And you're comparing the ones with the divorced parents to the ones without it. But if you're only looking at people in treatment, then you haven't given everyone, the same chance of getting into your sample. As we talked about, there are certain systematic reasons why some people wouldn't be in treatment and other people would. For example, bias against men. There's a gender bias. Men are much less likely to get treatment than women. And so you're biasing your sample, or at least you're biasing it towards people who are pro-treatment, pro-treatment people. And that might, for example, limit your sample away from religious people. A lot of religious people, if they're having problems in their marriage, they don't go to treatment, they go to their priest or their minister and try to figure out spiritually and religiously, how do I solve this problem? But people who go to treatment are people who believe, a doctor is who you should go to. You should treat this problem medically. And so you're going to bias your sample towards people who believe in medicine and doctors, and away from people who, look for other sources of healing and guidance. So those were biased samples. Not all clinical studies are biased, but what they have is, the problem is no control and what's called self-selection bias. People themselves chose to be in therapy, and some people chose not to be in therapy, but that means they were selecting themselves to be in your sample. And if you're a good scientist, you want to be very controlled about who gets in your sample, who doesn't. And you want to make sure it's random. And you also want to have what's called a control group. You want to have people that aren't in your study that you can compare to. But if you're only looking at people in treatment and you're not comparing them to people not in treatment, then you really don't have a complete look at your people in treatment. You're biasing, you're narrowing your focus. So Kuntz took out those flawed studies. But again, I'm not just talking about Kuntz here. I'm helping you understand some basic ideas around sampling strategy. I want to make sure everybody gets in there. Everybody has an equal chance to get in there. What that means is that your sample then would be random, meaning I didn't bias it towards any particular group. Everybody in this group had same chance to get into this group. And by making it random, you made it representative, meaning this group actually represents this big one. If I only have people in treatment in my group, but this group has a bunch of people not in treatment, then it's not representing this group. If I have only right-handed people in here and not some left-handed people, then it's biased. So you want to randomize it to make sure that it represents the thing you're trying to study. Otherwise, your results will be flawed. And so she took out the studies that were flawed, the ones that only focused on people in treatment and didn't have control groups. And she still finds that there's a correlation. There is a correlation between divorce and emotional and school problems. But again, we need to understand what correlations are. The way I like to think of it is you have two groups of people here. You have people whose parents are divorced, and you have people whose parents are not divorced. Parents divorced, parents not divorced. And we're asking what percentage, what portion of each group has emotional and school problems. There are people in both groups that do. And there's a vast majority of people in both groups that don't. So you're talking about, you know, some percentage like this down here, and for this group, the percentage is more like this. So we're not saying that people whose parents are together never have problems, and we're not at all saying people whose parents aren't together always have problems. We're simply saying, and she's simply saying, there's a correlation here that if you're in this group, your chances, your probability of having these problems is a little higher than if you're in this group. The good news is the vast majority of people in both groups don't have these problems. But if it were the case that your parents being divorced gave you a much stronger chance of having these problems, then that would be a concern, and we'd need to know that. So she does find a weak connection. There's some chance that if you're in this group, you have more chance of having these. It's enough of a chance to be called statistically significant. But that doesn't mean that you've proved that divorce is a problem for kids. You've simply shown there's a correlation, and correlation is not causation. So she begins to ask, what else could have happened? After your parents get divorced, what else might happen to you, or that they might do to you or not do to you, that might end up causing emotional and school problems for you? We can also ask, and have to ask, aren't there things that could have happened during the marriage while they were together that had lasting effects and made you have emotional and school problems, even though, you know, and so that even if they hadn't gotten divorced, you would have those problems? That would be what's called an antecedent variable. So we're looking for, in order to be rigorous, we talked about 3 criteria of causation. She's already shown us X comes first, then Y. That's the first criterion. When X goes up, Y goes up too. And when X goes down, Y goes down. She showed us that. That's the correlation part. So if you can satisfy the first 2, X came first before Y, and when X moves, Y moves. It's dependent on X. Then you're showing there's a correlation. But the third criterion is, have you ruled out other reasons why people whose parents are divorced have a slightly higher chance? And to rule those out, we have to look. We have to go, well, could there be something in between? Could there be something before? And if your data allows it, if you have data on those things, you can test and see, are these other variables correlated with emotional school problems? So we talked about some of those, what those are. A big one would be things like residential change. Are people who have to move out of their home in the middle of high school more likely to have emotional school problems? The answer in her data was yes. And it didn't matter why that happened, whether it was because your dad was in the military, or your dad got a new job, or your mom did, or because your parents got divorced. Whatever the reason was why you moving can cause emotional and school problems. Another variable she looked at was like too much TV, because sometimes what can happen is if your parents are going through divorce, you watch more TV than you should. And is too much TV correlated? Again, regardless of why you're watching too much TV, when we measure how much TV do you watch? 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, 10 hours a day? The kids who report having many hours of TV a day have more emotional and school problems. And so then again, it didn't matter whether they were divorced or not. It was the TV watching that's the problem. We mentioned a whole bunch of other things like financial problems, financial instability. Is that associated with emotional and school problems? Yes, kids who experienced like evictions from their homes or long unemployment of one parent or the other are more likely to have these problems. Whether or not their parents ended up splitting up as a result, you're more likely to have these problems. We can also look before the divorce. A big one here is things like abuse. Seeing your parents abuse each other cause problems? It can. What about if your parents are drug addicts? Yes, it can. And drug addicts and physical abuse and emotional abuse, those can all lead to divorce for sure. But even if they don't, even if your parents stay together, they can lead to emotional and school problems. Another one we talked about was father or mother absence. If your parents just are out of the picture after they get divorced, that can harm you. But if your parents are out of the picture for other reasons, like your dad died or your mom died or something like that, then or put in prison, those two can have emotional school problems. So it isn't simply that they're not married that's the problem, it's that you're not seeing them that might be the problem. And so again, it's about really focusing on what is the cause. Yes, it's correlated with divorce, but it isn't the cause. And so what does she conclude from this? She says we can't conclude that divorce is the cause of these emotional and school problems. There's too many other possible variables that are also correlated with that. And when you really think about it in a critical way, what is divorce? How do we operationalize that term? In other words, how do we compare people whose parents are divorced to people who aren't? Well, it's a pretty basic thing of, did they file papers in court to end their marriage, to dissolve their marriage? And by the way, there's lots of people with different situations. Like maybe you never, like I'm not actually married to my wife. Like we didn't legally marry. We had a wedding. We call each other Mr. and Mrs. Fox, but we didn't do the legal thing. Why? Because there's tax reasons. That if you're actually married and filing jointly, you pay more taxes than if you file separately, which is called the marriage penalty, and they shouldn't have it in this country, but they do. So it kind of creates a weird incentive to not get married, which we're following. But that means that if we separated and I moved out, then my kids, I wouldn't be measured as divorced. My kids would be experiencing divorce anyway. It's okay, it's okay. Then we just wouldn't be, they wouldn't be measured, they wouldn't be counted. And so there's a lot of people out there with different kinds of arrangements with their parents and stuff that don't get counted in this question. But if we're just counting people whose parents are divorced, what are we counting? People who filed papers. And does filing papers harm kids? Probably not. So it isn't the filing, it isn't the divorce act, the act of dissolving your marriage that harms kids. It's things you do to your kids before you dissolve your marriage, like abusing them, things like that. Or it's things that happen to kids after you dissolve your marriage, like moving them far away from their friends in school, or making them watch too much TV, or putting them in a worse financial situation than they were before. Those are things that can harm them, but it wasn't the signing of the papers that caused that. It was other choices that people made. So again, as a society, if we're asking, should we make it harder for people to end their marriage? And there are many conservatives who say that. They say we've gone too far in letting people get divorced. But her research says, would making divorce harder make kids safer? And she says, I don't think that the research shows that, because there's so many other reasons why kids are getting harmed that just making it harder for their parents to dissolve their marriage wouldn't really address those things. In fact, it might make it worse, because if a lot of the harm is happening during the marriage, then ending the marriage would probably be better for the kid than keeping it going. And I, by the way, base my own choices in life on a lot of this research I'm talking to you about. I ended up divorcing my daughter's mom. And at the time, I really agonized about it. I'm like, am I a terrible person? Am I ruining my daughter's lives and stuff? And, we're now 10 years later, both my daughters are doing really well. So I feel like I didn't harm them too bad. My older daughter's at UCSB getting straight A's, and my younger daughter's, crushing it at Rockland High. So, but the key is, I tried to avoid the mistakes. I didn't become absent from their lives. I didn't leave them in a worse financial situation. I didn't go around bad-mouthing their mom to them all the time. I didn't go around saying it's fine what I did and your mom's terrible. It's a bad thing that happened, but we're trying to move past it. Anyway, so as long as you stay a person's father and do all the things fathers do, then they still have a father. They just don't have a father that's married to their mom, but that's maybe not as bad as some people worry about. And certainly maybe if the government had prevented me from leaving their mom, I don't know that they'd be better off right now. I'm pretty sure all of us would be a lot worse off because we weren't doing well at the time. So anyway, that's me talking about. But so hopefully that helps us answer some of those questions. So let's take a look then. So what did we learn then? So what is a random representative sample and what are the best ways to make one? Well, we didn't fully answer that question. I did say that one that's random representative is, it gives everybody in the research population the same chance as everybody else to get into the research sample. That we did learn. We didn't talk about best ways to do that, not during the review, but when we were talking about the research process, I gave you an example of if you wanted to get a sample of Yuba College students, what would be the best way to do that? And we talked about different techniques you might use that weren't good because they were going to bias your sample in one way or the other, like standing outside the library and handing out surveys. You're going to bias it in various ways, like the people who aren't on campus don't get to be in your study. The people who only come to campus at night aren't going to be in your study. The shy people aren't going to be in your study. So we talked about giving surveys to professors. A random sample of professors might be the best way to ensure that a random sample of students was given the survey. So we answered that question, number 6. Number 7, what does she mean by putting divorce in perspective? I didn't actually just fully answer that one right now, but I did when I lectured. What does she mean, do you think, by putting in perspective? What kind of perspective? Somebody want to try to answer that? What kind of perspective did we just use to analyze divorce? Did we use a religious perspective, a mystical perspective, feminism? Did we use political ideology? What did we use when we were using Kuntz to study divorce? What kind of perspective did we use? Did we look at the Bible? How did Kuntz and us decide whether divorce is a good or is a harmful thing or not? Did we use the Bible? What did we use just now?
Statistics.
Yeah, and what process were we using when we were looking at how variables are connected to each other, when we were using logic and evidence as the basis of our decision making on whether divorce harms people or not? What's that called? What is the research process in sociology based on? What perspective does it use? Religious? Don't know? What is the research process that we talked about? There's another name for it. The research process is also known as the blank process. It's called science. Science, folks. And sociology claims to be a science, but not many people don't think it is. But that's what we were doing, science here. When you're trying to abstract things and look at how variables are connected, when you're using logic and data, when you're asking whether it's tautological or falsifiable, all of that is using science to decide. And we've been comparing science to other perspectives. The religious perspective that uses faith and says things like, well, God created the universe and I just know because I believe in God. That is another way of knowing. It's the religious way of knowing, and it's perfectly valid, and lots of people have it. It's just not something we do in a college classroom. We use the scientific perspective, at least not in a sociology science classroom. So we use the methods of science to decide. And but in Kuntz's case, she was saying there are other people deciding about divorce. Like if you ask an American, like, should divorce be harder to get or not? And a lot of people will give you strong opinions on that. But what are they basing their opinions on? Is it based on science and scientific consideration of the evidence and, logic and evidence? Some people base it on the Bible. They say, well, I just know divorce is wrong because the Bible says it. Or other people will say, I just know divorce is fine because I'm a feminist and I know that women need to have the right to, get rid of bad marriages. Well, that's a political perspective, feminism. Christianity is a religious perspective. Those are valid ways for people to decide their own thinking. But in sociology, so Kuntz is saying, I'm going to use the scientific perspective to decide this question. So there's Christians that know that divorce is wrong and they're never going to think it's okay. And there's feminists that think divorce is always okay and you should never worry about it. But a scientist asks the question. They don't know the answer. They're asking, does divorce harm kids? And they're using data to decide, data and evidence, and they're using logic to analyze that data and evidence to see And so that's how she approached it. She put it in scientific perspective, and she used data and evidence to decide whether divorce harms people. We're just getting started on this, so I'm going to be here as long as you want me to be. I didn't set a time. I guess maybe you feel you have other places to go. But I am recording this, so I'm going to post this video later on YouTube. But those of you who want to stay, you should stay. I'm not even done talking about Kuntz, and that's only question 9. But anyway, if you've got more important things to do, I can't stop you. So when did Kuntz when Kuntz did her meta-study of divorce, why was her first analysis of the data flawed? And we talked about that, flawed clinical studies that didn't have random representative samples or controls. What is it people have to go to, by the way? I'm curious. What is it you guys are going to? Where do people have to go right now?
Me, what?
Okay. Well, good luck to you. I'm here to help, but I don't want to help. Can't help you. One thing I didn't talk about is, and we didn't really get into some of this, so it's important that I do. The next question is, what are some examples of antecedent variables? So we talked about some of those. The ones that happen before divorce, like abuse. And by the way, some of those could be on either side of X there. Some of those could be intervening. But things like cheating while you're married, infidelity, I didn't talk about that one, but that's a variable she looked at. You know, financial problems before you got divorced, abuse problems before you got divorced, antisocial mothers, like the personality of the parents, could be an antecedent variable. And then we talked about intervening things that happen after the parents split up, but that didn't have to happen, like moving far away or leaving you, the kids ended up worse off financially, or the kids got put in the middle. That was a big one I talked about when I lectured, like having to carry messages from one parent to the other, or even insults from one parent to the other. Open conflict, seeing your parents fighting with each other. These are all things that she found are correlated with emotional school problems. And that's led to her conclusion, which I didn't really just talk about, but I did when I lectured. She says we shouldn't really just look at this event of signing the divorce papers as the problem. We should look at this whole process, like before you sign papers, the whole things that lead up to that, the fighting, the abuse, the financial problems, whatever it might be that led to that day where you ended the marriage. And ending the marriage was part of the process, but then there's also the post-dissolution process where you try to pick up the pieces and move forward. And that's, again, a part of the process where kids may experience things that harm them. So she says we should be looking at this whole process of divorce, not just at the divorce event. And if we just make it harder or easier to divorce, we're just focusing on the divorce event and we're not looking at this larger process that happens before and after that day. So I'm trying to show you with my hands how we visualize that when we talked about it. Divorce is dissolution of the marriage. We dissolve the marriage. That's a legal thing. But there was a bunch of things that happened before that day, and a bunch of things that happened after that day. And this is the whole divorce process. Not the divorce event, the divorce process. And it's during that process that kids can be harmed. And that's why I was saying I tried in my own divorce process to not harm my kids if I could. I'm sure they were harmed to some extent. But the idea is to minimize it. And how do we minimize it? That's another question, and that I didn't get to just now, but she says we need to institutionalize it. We need to make it a public thing. Right now, divorce happens as a private matter between the couple. Right now, it's private and adversarial, meaning it's a fight. It's done through the court system. It's a purely legal process where one party fights another. And they fight each other and try to kind of ruin the other one. And that in itself is a damaging thing to kids, to have your parents that you love in an adversarial fight over who gets what, including the kids, is not healthy, not healthy from a family perspective, is what Kuntz is saying, with a lot of things that can happen during an adversarial process that harm kids. Like you end up living with your mom with worse finances than you did before. So she's saying we need to think of it more as not a private adversarial process, but as a public and social process. To make it more social means to make it more like an institution. What is that term, institution? It's that functionalist idea that there are building blocks of a society, and if they are well-functioning building blocks, then the whole society can function well. And the family is one of those building blocks. And divorce isn't really part of the institution of family. We treat it as this separate thing that happens to end a family. But kids still have parents after the divorce, they still are a family in a way. And they are, it's a blended family or a co-parenting family or something like that. And so she says we need to think of it that way. And institutions have things like clear norms, rules about how you treat each other. How should I treat my ex? Should I be bad-mouthing her to my kids? Should I be ruining her financially? Or is it in my kid's interest and in my responsibility to make sure she's doing okay financially, that I don't badmouth her to the kids, that I don't make them feel bad about her, because that was my relationship, not theirs, with her. But anyway, those are norms, rules about it. Also, rights and responsibilities. In an institution like a school or government, it's very clear whose rights are what, whose responsibilities are what. But in the divorce process, people aren't really sure. How am I supposed to handle this? How am I supposed to act to my kids? How am I supposed to act towards my ex? What rights does she have? What rights do I have? Again, it's all done through the legal process, so lawyers know all this stuff. But if it was more like an institutional thing, like in a school, students know what their rights are toward the classroom. You expect me to teach. And if I'm not doing my job, you would know it, and you'd be able to go complain to higher ups and say, this guy's just not teaching, he's doing terrible. But in a private thing, if a dad's doing a terrible job of divorcing your mom, what right do you have to say anything about it or correct the situation? But if we had it to be a more institutionalized process, then people's rights would be more clear and spelled out and put into the law and things like that. And rituals. Another thing institutions have are rites of passage that help people move from one stage to another. Like from being in the family, from being single to married. We have a big ritual for that called a wedding. When kids grow into adults, a lot of cultures have a ritual for that, from going from child to adult. We don't have a ritual for going from married to not married. It's just something that people have to have happen to them. But when you surround it with ritual, with meaning, with symbols, you can make it more meaningful to people and make it actually maybe healthier. They can deal with it more. But like the way it is now, it's like an unresolved, open wound. And that's how my divorce still feels, is my ex still is hurting about it, and my kids still feel pain about it, and I do. And a ritual can help you get closure. It can help you move from that thing that was to this new thing that is, and move in a way that makes it better. So anyway, that's some of the main questions I had that are on the guide about Kuntz. Let's see what else we can cover real quick here. All right, well, there's several questions about Anderson. Do you want me to cover those?
Yeah.
Okay. So questions 12, 13, and 14 all have to do with Anderson. So again, I think it helps to situate your knowledge in relation to other knowledge. So we were just talking about Kuntz. She's a functionalist. She is looking at the family as an institution, trying to get the institution to function better, trying to redefine the institution to see divorce as part of it, so that we can help divorce run more smoothly. So she is thinking like a functionalist about let's try to get things to work more harmoniously and smoothly in this big thing called society, this machine called society. she's also using numbers, big data, and numbers to answer her research question. And that's typical of the functionalists because they're looking at big things like the family as their site of their research. But Anderson comes at things more as a symbolic interactionist. She is not looking at numbers or big things. His perspective is more micro, more a smaller perspective. And so, so we said he was a qualitative sociologist, a qualitative study of the family, not quantitative. And that it is, and that it's micro. He's got a small n. It's micro sociology. His small n is one particular neighborhood. One ghetto, one black ghetto. Ghetto is a word that sometimes is pejorative, but it has a specific sociological meaning. If you have a neighborhood that's mainly all one group, one, say, religious group or one ethnic group, it can be called a ghetto, meaning it's not diverse. And it's especially called a ghetto if people have been forced to live in that situation rather than just willingly choosing it. And so America has a lot of ethnic ghettos, or what we call ethnic enclaves when I talked about LA. But poor black people in a lot of cities have been forced to live together. There were, housing restrictions on who could live where. And so Philadelphia is one of those places that has a largely black ghetto. And he studied that one particular black ghetto in his study. So it's, again, qualitative and micro. And he was trying to answer a lot of research questions or have a lot of ideas come up during the research. So a basic idea I try to get across with Anderson is this idea that culture, which is the thing he's able to study, if you're doing qualitative up-close study of people, what you're really looking at isn't sort of the who has what question. To look at who has what, that's the structure of things, you would need to go look at numbers, like look at incomes people have, rents they pay, other costs they have. That's a more of a quantitative question when you're trying to look at who has what. But if you're trying to look at how people experience life and the meanings they attach to the things they're doing, then you're talking about who thinks and feels what. That's culture. But as we've tried to see in this class, structure and culture aren't separate things, really. And I shouldn't use a slash. Maybe I'm going to use a double arrow here. Structure and culture affect each other. In other words, if you're trying to understand why a particular community has a certain kind of culture, well, you might want to go look at the structure of that community. But at the same time, if you want to understand the structure of a community, you need to pay attention to its culture. What is the culture that Anderson finds? Well, he was trying to find, he's trying to study teen pregnancy. Why do young men and women why do young men seem to impregnate young women at a higher rate? And that's actually a quantitative piece of information. But yeah, starting with that quantitative thing, why is there a higher rate of teen pregnancy in this community than others? And he focuses on the culture, but as we talked about, he says, you have to look at the peer cultures in this ghetto. And they tend to be segregated. They're, first of all, sex segregated. So you have males on one side and females on the other. The males is also age segregated. So you just see young men hanging out together without older men, or young little boys hanging out together without teenagers and without older men. With the women, it's more intergenerational. So you will see older women and younger women hanging out together. And the cultures that he talks about, for the boys, it's a culture of playing. These are young males. And he says what they all talk about and are obsessed with is being players. Talking about who's a player, who's not a player, who's a playa hater, who's not a playa hater, hate the playa, not the game, or whatever. Um, and so trying to understand as a sociologist, what is all this talk about? Why are guys talking about playing, and what does it mean to play, and why does it matter so much to them to be a player or to talk about who's a player and who's not a player? What's going on there? And he says it has to do with social status via or from sexual conquest. It's about proving who's who by who's, bedding down who. Young guys are trying to prove they're special by who they can claim to have had sex with. And that's not weird, people wanting status. It's maybe a basic fact about human life that when we live in communities, there's this issue of who's who and who gets to be up here and who's down here. And so humans are always looking around at status and trying to figure out what their status is and who has status. And a lot of human behavior is about that. I've been watching Planet of the Apes movies, but apes are also social beings, and status is a big thing with apes. Like if you watch those movies, the big thing is like who kisses whose hand, or who touches whose hand, and how you act when you're in the presence of somebody with higher status and things like that. But why are young boys using sex as the thing? In Anderson's view, this shows the structure is missing. Something's missing in the structure, because in a normal, healthy community, people would be using things like their jobs, their income, their education level. Those are the things that normal American society uses to decide who has status or not. But in this particular community, nobody has status of that kind. They don't have good jobs and good education and money. So what can you use to say who's who? We can use who slept with who. Another possibility is to use who's a better criminal than who, but that's a whole other culture that also exists in this community, and that's the culture of hustling, or playing, basically who's a hustler or not, gangsta. So that's a whole other culture that we're not even talking about, but it's similar in that it's young men trying to have status and using, in this case, not sex, but money and how much crime you've done to get the money. And so like a lot of rap music is guys bragging about money, but in that case, they might be bragging about the money they've made as a rapper, or they might even say it's money they made as a drug dealer or things like that. But anyway, it's bragging about money based on being a hustler or a gangster. But again, it reflects, it's a pathological is what he calls it. It's unhealthy, this kind of culture, but it reflects an unhealthy structure. There should be more jobs, more education, more other ways to earn status in the community. For the female peer culture, it's about babies. Somehow babies are the things that gives people things they need that the community lacks. So structurally, this community doesn't have certain things. And so instead, a culture of babies has grown up around in the community. What do babies give? Well, babies, for one thing, give hope. Even more importantly, they give positive social interaction, as we talked about. The women in this community can all get together and talk and interact, positive social interactions. When a baby's born, when there's a newborn, you can have baby showers, you can have potlucks, bringing food around, other reasons to all get together. And these women crave that. The ghetto is full of non-hope and non-positive interaction. And so babies provide something that's missing, or the chance to have something that's missing, which is positive social interactions and hope. And so again, it's not good for 14 and 13-year-old girls to want to have a baby so they can. Babies also bring status, as we talked about. For the teenage girl, now that you get to go to these social interactions with the older moms, and they're giving you their children's baby clothes and they're making food for you, you now have status. You're somebody that they're doing things for. The highest women in the community, the moms, are helping you. Now you're not a teen punk anymore, you're a mom. and you're getting the mom status. And so again, that's not normal. 14-year-old girls should be like in my community or in this one, thinking about graduating high school and going to college or getting a good job or, getting married or something like that, maybe as ways of achieving status in life. There was that football punter that just said, women will only be happy if they have kids. I don't know if you've heard about that guy. They're not happy getting a job, but anyway, no, he's getting canceled for saying that. But anyway, what was I thinking? So it's not healthy, it's not normal, but it's understandable given the lack of other ways to achieve status for young women in that community. So what can we say? So that's kind of the first question on there. What structural factors does Elijah Anderson use to explain the high number of teen pregnancy? Well, this lack of education, lack of opportunities for education, lack of opportunities for jobs, lack of opportunities for other kinds of status. Like I would even say volunteer organizations. If you don't have like a boys club and girls club to go join, or a Boy Scouts, or even a church or something that you can be part of that gives you status, then you've got to find some other way of getting status. So those are these structural things. This is what the community doesn't have, is ways to get status. So is that clear, the answer to that one? Then number 13 asks, what is playing all about, and why do young males in the neighborhood want to be seen as players, according to Anderson? He said it was all about proving their status. As we talked about, to be a player, to be considered, to have the status of a player, yes, it means getting girls, but how? It isn't just getting the conquest. You have to be clever. You have to have outsmarted the girls. So when these guys brag about being players, they don't just say, yeah, I had a date with her. They say, oh, she thought this was going to happen, but this is what actually happened. And you have to be hard-hearted. You have to show that I didn't care. I didn't cry. I wasn't affected at all. I got what I needed and wanted, and then I was out of there. I hit it and quit it. And so being clever, being hard-hearted, that's all part of the thing, of the status. And if you can't convince your peers that you are those things too, then they won't consider you a player and you won't have achieved that status. So that answers number 13, criteria for being considered a player. I guess I didn't ask on here about the culture of babies, but he talks about that as well, that these women lack opportunities to get together and smile. They get together for things like funerals and stuff, but to get together with a baby and a baby shower is a much different thing. They have a lot of reasons to not be hopeful about all the poverty and addiction and problems they see, but a baby gives a chance to be hopeful, to say, hey, maybe this guy will be the next Michael Jordan or something, or the next 50 Cent or something. All right, so I think that covers Anderson pretty well. The third family one that we talked about was Bakazin and Eitzen, and they were looking at things from a conflict theory perspective. So they were reviewing already existing data. In other words, they didn't collect their own data, but they were compiling data and reviewing data to make a point. I mean, theirs was an essay, not a study. But I see there's a little error here. But what do they mean that family organization causes conflict? Well, what we talked about was, here in America, the way we define family is part of the reason that our families have so much conflict. One of the ways we define families is we call them private. In America, we have the concept of private property, and we usually expect that a family lives on a piece of private property, like a home. And we think of that as the private sphere. There's what's known as the public sphere. That's like where when you go to work, you're entering the public. When you go vote and go be involved in politics and go demonstrate against the war or something like that, you're entering the public square and the public sphere. But women, for example, were always defined in Western history for the last several centuries as private. Women were defined as not to leave the home, really. They're under the care and control of men. They can leave the home with the men, you know, under certain circumstances. You know, in Arabic countries too, you leave the home, you still have to be private and cover your, in Islamic countries, I mean, cover your head so that the men who control you don't, other men don't get to see you. And so you're not public, you're private. And in America too, was traditionally the thinking. And so a man also thought that my private home are things I get to do. I get to do things in my private home that I would never do in public, because that's the public, but in private, that's my sphere. And it's sort of like people think the law stops at my home. There's the law out there that the cops are in charge of, and then there's the law here in my home that I'm in charge of. And that kind of mentality is why some men do things to their wives and children that they would never do to their coworker or to their buddies or anybody like that, because it wouldn't be acceptable in public. But in private, it's seen as like, this is my business, I get to do this. We also organize the family as unequal. Our families are not democracies. We live in a democratic society, but the way we've defined family in America is as an authoritarian structure. For a lot of families, it's the dad is the king, and dad's home is his castle, and dad gets to call all the shots. And so it's not rule of law, that's what a democracy is. It's rule of this guy, this dictator. And that's the recipe for conflict. Again, conflict happens when one guy says, you have to do it this way, and other people say, no, we don't want to. Now you have conflict. And how is the guy going to handle that? Well, some guys just turn to violence as the way to make sure I'm the one who calls the shots and you're not. But it is possible to have democratic families. It is possible to organize your family in a way where the children have some say in the decisions, the wife has a lot of say in the decisions. It doesn't mean everybody's totally equal, just like in American democracy. The president, the senators, the congressmen, they have more power than a regular citizen, but a regular citizen has some say in the decision making. We get to vote on it, we get to help decide it. And so that model might be if you want to have less conflict. And that, by the way, is what democracy claims to provide. Is in authoritarian societies, you know, like Iran or something, or Russia is a perfect example. If you're an authoritarian society and you're the dictator Putin, you say, we're going to war, and then other people say, I don't think we should be fighting Ukraine. Well, what can you do? Kill them, or you lock them up or something. And so that's violence. But democracy, if you don't agree with the president, you can hopefully express yourself in a peaceful way. That's why people get mad at the protesters. If you're blocking things or making it unsafe for people to go to college with your encampment, then you're not respecting this peaceful idea that in a democracy, we can disagree with each other without it being violent, because we have laws and rules that we're all following. And in the same way, it is possible to have a family where there is disagreement, but there isn't fighting. There's peaceful resolution of the conflict. But the way we organize it now, private and unequal and undemocratic, means that a lot of families just have constant conflict over who gets to call the shots, who has to do what, who gets to say, and then people resorting, especially men, to violence as the way to maintain their power and control over the situation. The next question, 17, why are the data on wife abuse sometimes misleading? Well, the main reason is because people don't report it. So a lot of wife abuse never gets reported, and the data we have when we're trying to figure out what are the variables that cause divorce. We're like, okay, we know, not divorce, wife abuse. Well, if only 1/3 is reported, that means the data we have is only looking at 1/3 of the women that are getting beat up. And so if we try to figure out what are the reasons these women are getting beat up, we're leaving out 2/3 of the people. And so the data tell us certain things, but we're not sure it's true. Like, it looks like poor people, poor women, poor family, or poverty, looks like poverty might be a cause. In other words, the data tell us that people in poverty are more likely to have wife abuse happen to them. But the data are flawed. It's a lot of good reasons to think that wealthier women just don't report it. They have a lot of reasons not to report it. They're gonna lose their income, lose their house, lose other things. So am I really gonna call the cops on a husband because he got drunk and punched me? Whereas poor women have a lot less reason to worry about the cops and to just call them to get this guy out of here. So it's very possible that it's poor women are more likely to report wife abuse, not that poor women are more likely to experience wife abuse. Race was another one that when you look at the data, it looks like Black and Latino women are getting beat up more. But we don't know if that's actually the case because Asian women are very unlikely to report wife abuse. Because for them, a lot of them, family's even more private than it is for a lot of Anglo and Western people or English and French and all that. So we don't know, and a lot of Asian women also are experiencing, financial, economic situations that might make it a reason not to report it. So that's why, because there's so much underreporting of wife abuse, the data that we have, that's official data from the police on who's been beaten up or not, can be very misleading. But there are other variables that we do believe, and Bacchus and Knightson do believe, are strongly correlated with wife abuse, and we don't really question them. And those are things like, alcohol and drug abuse. I mean, substance abuse is strongly correlated to the point of really being a causal factor. All other things being equal, if you don't abuse drugs and alcohol, you're much less likely to abuse your wife than somebody who does. We also mentioned a family history was a very strong or robust variable. That all other things being equal, if your dad beat his mom, if your dad beat your mom up, you're gonna have a lot more chance of beating your children's mom up. So number 18 says, why do the authors mean by patriarchal terrorism? We said, well, they see wife abuse as a symptom of a larger social problem. And they see it as, we have inequality in our society between men and women. Women just don't have the same structural or cultural power that men have. And there are some men that want to keep it that way, that in their own homes they want to, force down any attempt by their wives or daughters to have equality with them. So they like patriarchy. They want men to be in charge of women and children. That's what this punter for the football team was basically saying. I want a world where men are the ones making money and getting the glory and out in the world, out in public, and women stay home and serve their husbands and children. And he basically thinks women are happier being servants to women and children, to men and children, than having their own status and power. But Bacchus and Knightson strongly reject that idea and say, no, women want equality with men, and they don't want to be treated as less than or secondary or second class, and they certainly don't want men using violence to keep them in a second class status. But they say and the reason they call it patriarchal terrorism too is a lot of people blame men themselves for their wife abuse. And that's reasonable, but at the same time, does that solve the problem? If we try to help each individual man become a nicer guy, we might never solve the problem because in their view, it comes from patriarchy. And we have all these institutions and other things that are teaching men to be dominators and abusers and those things. And so as long as we have those institutions, those laws, those cultures and traditions, then we're going to keep on raising boys that end up being patriarchal terrorists. So they want to turn the attention away from the individual men who do it and turn the attention to a society we have that's raising our children in this way to be patriarchal terrorists. And that means we need to tackle patriarchy. We need to actually have a society that isn't patriarchal, one where women actually do have equality with men. and the same chances and the same status and the same everything else. Otherwise, if there is inequality, there will be some men that want to use violence to keep it that way. Does that make sense? All right, so that was all of our family research. I see on here the formatting got weird. That education research is supposed to be the heading for the next several questions. So 19 and 20 and all the way up through carbon footprint. So 19 all the way through 28 are our education questions. I'll just try to quickly answer most of these. So 19 says, what are the manifest and latent functions of education, according to the instructor, and what is meant by the term legitimized meritocracy? So we had already covered the manifest and latent functions of schools earlier in the class, and we talked about the idea that schools on the manifest side, and what we all know schools are supposed to do, is teach basic skills and teach citizenship and things like that. On the other side, though, we don't often pay attention to the hidden things schools teach, like teaching kids to just sit at desks and do what they're told, which is something that reflects the class. You know, it's working class students are taught that way, whereas richer students, more upper class students, get more freedom and voice in the classroom than working class students generally do. So that's what they call the hidden curriculum. It's like, or another one we used was just locking kids up all day performs a function for society that, you know, goes beyond or is, you know, separate from the educational function. And then we mentioned a new one. We said one we didn't talk about last time when we talked about manifest and latent functions was this idea of legitimized meritocracy. Meritocracy is a society based on achievement, a society where you earn your place, you earn your status. In other words, instead of status being based on something like your race or your class that you were born into, it's based on what you've achieved in your life, like how far did you go in school? How far did you go on your job? How many skills do you have? And we say in America that that's what separates us from some other places where there's, you know, places like India where your caste determines where you end up in life, or England too, where class is a big effect on where you get to be in society. In America, we say it doesn't matter where you come from or what your family was, you yourself as an individual can rise as far as you're willing to work. Well, how do we legitimize that idea? In other words, do we just say it? Is it just a claim we make? Or is it actually a fact? How do we make it legit, the fact, legit the case, as the students would say, that you can rise in America? We supposedly do it through our public education system. And we say through public education, since it's free, you can, regardless of your parents' background or anything else, you know, achieve through school, you know, what other people might have just been handed to them when they were born. So that's why we began to add, that's led us into Kozel. Is it actually true that our schools are giving everybody an equal chance to succeed in America, regardless of their background? And he says, no, we're vastly unequal, our schools, and it has to do with funding. So his whole article, or that unit was called Savage Inequalities. So he starts from this fact that our schools aren't equal, and they're really very different. So for example, if you go to poor inner city schools that are mainly populated by non-white students, you'll find very different conditions there, or at least he did in New York City, than the richer, newer schools on the outskirts of town in the suburban areas. And same was true when we were talking about LA. Downtown LA, LA County, the oldest county, is the poorest county with the oldest buildings, which is why the rents are cheaper there. And that's where poor people live. But that means the schools are also the old buildings there. And if you have old buildings, the money that the school has needs to be spent on just keeping the building running. And the fresher, newer schools on the outskirts, they can spend their money on things like computers and new teachers and things like that. So these inequalities come down to funding. Why is it a vicious cycle? Because funding is based on property values. And even when they're not, schools that, I mean, really what it comes down to is public schools are based on where you live. So they're situated in neighborhoods, and you go to the school that's in your neighborhood. But the neighborhoods aren't equal. So rich neighborhoods with rich people in them end up with schools that have a lot more money and resources than schools that are in poor neighborhoods, where the buildings don't have resources and the people in them don't have the resources. So they don't donate to the school and things like that. So nowadays we give, at a government level, we give equal funding to the schools, but on a day-to-day level, schools in richer areas end up with a lot more money because people donate, or they're not wasting their money on new tiles and things like that. They're using the money for education, not just for upkeep or maintenance. Why won't people donate more money to the poor schools if donations are what help? And he says, well, things have changed in America. We have this problem where the successful people don't see it as their responsibility anymore to help the poor people. Partly it's that rich people live in gated communities and things, and they live separate from the poor people. The poor people are in different neighborhoods with different schools with different conditions, and the rich don't even have to deal with it. And so just like we were talking about, it almost comes down to a way that you organize your city affects how you deal with your education. If you have a city that's very unequal, where all the rich people live on one side of town and their kids all go to private schools, then you're going to have probably underfunded public schools where nobody cares, or no new funding is coming. But you can organize your city in a way that the wealthy do need to deal more with the poor. I was like in Santa Barbara where I grew up, I don't know exactly how this or why this happened, but the way Santa Barbara is, Santa Barbara High, the biggest public high school, is on the east side of Santa Barbara, and the mountains, the hills of Santa Barbara are on the east side of Santa Barbara. So the rich people tend to live in the hills, and the closest public school is Santa Barbara High. So traditionally speaking, the rich people sent their kids to Santa Barbara High. But the high school itself is on the flatland of Santa Barbara, and that's the east side, where the east side locals are. I mean, that's where a lot of working class and Latino and poor people live, and they also send their kids to Santa Barbara High. So my high school, when I went there anyway, had a really interesting mix of some of the wealthiest people in town, their kids, and some of the poorest. And because Santa Barbara was known as a good high school, the rich people kept sending their kids there. But nowadays, with test scores being publicized and everything, I was saying to my wife, what if we moved to Santa Barbara? And she goes, well, I wouldn't let our kids go to Santa Barbara High because their test scores are so low. And but when I was going there, the rich people used to pride themselves. They go, well, we don't send our kids to private schools because Santa Barbara High is so great. You don't need to go to private school. We have a great public high school here in Santa Barbara. And so it was back in those days. I don't know what it's like now, but I have a feeling that rich people more and more in Santa Barbara are sending their kids to the private schools of that community, and the public schools are more and more just becoming the place where poor people in that neighborhood, or the people in that neighborhood, have to send their kids. Anyway, so, but he also mentioned Mississippi was part of its globalization. Our biggest, richest companies now make their money all around the world, and they don't necessarily care about American kids' ability to do well in school. They're not planning to employ them anyway. And so that's another reality that our school is facing, is they were designed at a time when American employers expected to hire American kids. And so American employers wanted to make sure the schools were well funded and the kids were actually learning. Now that a lot of companies make their money in China and elsewhere, they're not even looking at American schools and worried about how they're doing. That then led us to, so that was a conflict theory, Kozo looking at schools and asking very conflict theory type of questions, like how do poor people get educated versus how do rich people in America, and looking at structural questions like how do we fund the education. But Schwartz is more of a qualitative sociologist, more of a symbolic interactionist, and so rather than asking how do we fund our schools and how do poor people experience them versus rich people, he's asking a more cultural question, which is, what do we mean by learning anymore? And he says we've debased our understanding of learning. We used to think of learning as a valuable thing in and of itself, an intrinsic value. And we nowadays more and more just see learning as a tool to get something else that's more valuable, like money. Just like I was, earlier in the class today. If all you're worried about is your grade, then you're not going to want to hear me talking about smart growth and stuff. But in my mind, that's actually more valuable knowledge. Like as you go forward in life, knowing how to live in a city and what a good way for cities to develop is probably quite valuable. But our society is putting pressure on you to get a good grade. So you're not even listening to that part of the lecture. And you're like, no, just tell me what I need to know for the exam. And so to me, you know, that's, and to Schwartz, that's a debase, that's a lower version of learning. All you're worried about is your grade and what I need to know to get a score on the test. You're not really using all your brain and all your faculties as a human being to be a smart, educated, thoughtful person. So we've debased learning by making it work, by making it about the extrinsic rewards of your grade, your degree, your job, and your money, rather than the intrinsic reward of, wow, you just learned a whole bunch of stuff you didn't know. Your brain is much bigger now, full of more information and thinking and knowledge. The connections in your brain got made that you didn't have before. We don't value that in America anymore. We just value, well, how much money did it cost? Or did you get a good grade? No one asks you, what new connections did you make in your brain in that class? They go, what grade you got? A, great, good job. What's the difference between play and work, according to Schwartz? Well, play are the things that we do because they are intrinsically valuable to us. That's what we mean when we say we're playing. We're doing something that we want to be doing for its own reward. We say we're working when we're doing something to get some other reward. And so again, he's saying that's what we've done to education. We used to see it as its own reward, that learning is good. You will be happier when you're smarter. We will think of you more highly when you're smarter than when you're not smart. But nowadays, we just look at these more extrinsic things like how much money, what job did you get with that learning? How much money can you make at that job? And in Schwartz's view, that's an impoverished way. That's not the best way to look at learning. And that we learn better actually when we don't put it in those terms. When we want to learn something because we want to learn it, it doesn't feel like work, it feels like flow. Like, have you ever been involved in something so much that you weren't even worried about anything else because you were so focused on that thing? That flow state of really just being in the moment and learning and creating is a great state to be in, but a lot of people don't get to experience it anymore because they're so worried about what they're going to get later that they're not really focused on what they're experiencing right now. Anyway, so what evidence does he present that learning is better when it's intrinsic? Well, he mentioned like these reading studies. When you tell kids, hey, you should read so you can get paid $1 a book, they don't really read and they don't really learn from the things they're not really reading. When you tell people, go read what you want to read so you can enjoy reading, they pick things they want to read and then they actually learn what was in it. And, another example he used was his own daughter in the back seat of the car. When she was making up songs for herself in the back seat of the car, she was very creative and it was very interesting to her and she loved doing it. When her parents turned around and clapped and said, hey, do that again, then she couldn't even come up with anything. And Schwartz says that's because it became extrinsic. It was about mom and dad liking it rather than her liking it. And then it wasn't fun anymore and she wasn't creative anymore. All right, so then we thirdly turn to a functionalist study of education, Traub, and he says that the name of his article was What No School Can Do, and number 24 asked, when discussing school reform, why does Traub say that we need to do more than just reform schools? Because there are certain things schools can't do, and those things are needed if schools are going to be able to do what they can do, if that makes sense. Some of the things schools can't do is like read to children when they're small, when they're 2 and 3 years old. Parents can do that, and if they do that, it's going to help the schools do better. Schools can't feed children dinner and breakfast, but what you eat for dinner and breakfast can have a big impact on whether you're learning or not, and your brain is ready to learn or not. So this term we used was interconnectivity. In other words, schools are interconnected with the family home and with other institutions.
like neighborhoods. And schools can't do everything that, I mean, those institutions have certain jobs that they need to be doing. If schools can do their job, again, it's a functionalist way of looking at things. Got the school here, got the family here, they're supposed to be working together, but if this family is dysfunctional, then the school is dysfunctional. And so, what should families be doing, for example? Well, reading to kids, making sure they get healthy eating and nutrition, making sure they're healthy in general. And so he says if we just keep focusing on schools and what they're doing, like how they test people, how they teach math, how they teach reading, we might not fix our education problems very much because there's things schools can't do that need to be done for schools to be able to teach reading and math and those kinds of things. So he says, he asks us to look at this program called Impact, which tried to address what he's saying, that the family needs help. A lot of families aren't doing what they need to be doing. And if the school could find a way to help the families do what they're doing, need to be doing, then the school will be able to do what it needs to be doing. And so we talked about Impact being a multi-purpose social service agency. We said Impact provides things like nutrition services to families, literacy services to adults so they can learn to read better because a lot of people are immigrants and they might not know English that well. It provides basic clinical health care so that you don't need to go to the downtown emergency room to get antibiotics for your kid. You can get them right there at the school. And so all these functions that Impact is providing are like functions that a family might normally be expected to provide, but in certain low-income, poor communities, they have real trouble doing it. So when the school can help with that, then not only the families do better, they're healthier, they're stronger, they're more ready to learn, and then they miss less class days, they come to school on time, their brains are open the whole day, and then the school starts doing better. The test scores start going up at the school, more people start graduating, more people, don't come and destroy the school and things like that. So schools do better when they have this Impact program. But then he says, a lot of people, number 28, why do they face political resistance? So again, why aren't more schools and more states putting these kinds of programs on their school campuses where people can get help for their families? And he says it's because both liberals and conservatives have kind of knee-jerk reactions to this, things that they just end up believing before they've really looked at the evidence. Conservatives say things like, well, you're just throwing money at the problem. You're going to take my tax money, you're going to tax me more money so that you can give it to these poor families so they can read to their kids and feed their kids. But conservatives would say, whatever happened to personal responsibility? In other words, those people should be responsible for their own kids and their own food, not using my tax money to do it. Why would liberals be against it? Liberals might say, well, you're intervening too much in people's lives. If you're telling people how to eat and how to feed their kids, or you're telling people what to read to their kids, you are, not respecting people's cultural boundaries. And people, may have cultural reasons why they eat the foods they do, or teach their kids the way they do, or read the books they have. And so coming in as a liberal, coming in and telling people how to do things is maybe too interventionist. The term we used was too paternalistic. It's like the government acting like the parent and telling the parents how to parent instead of letting parents be the parents. But Traub says, no, both sides should not resist this. They should see it as actually advancing their goals. Conservatives want personal responsibility. If you don't want people being on welfare or being in prison, you want people taking care of themselves, then investing in Impact's a good idea because it teaches them to do that. And then one day their kids won't be in prison or won't be on welfare. Their kids will be making money at your company and helping you make money. So it's in your interest to invest in Impact. And for liberals, he says, again, yeah, you shouldn't be afraid of personal responsibility. If you don't want government invading people's lives, then having people learn how to take care of themselves, like good, feeding and healthcare and reading and financial management and stuff, if they can get better care of themselves, then they won't need government involvement in their lives, and that will be a good outcome for both liberals and conservatives. So he says it's, we got to get past our typical knee-jerk thing, like, oh, I heard that program and I'm against it. And ask, how does it actually, if you really look at it in a close way, actually fit with your political, convictions and viewpoint. So does that make sense, what I just said? All right, that was what we said about education. Then we got into cities and the environment. And this question 29 asks a key question, which is what I was trying to get across, that your own carbon footprint, how much you're responsible for global warming, how much carbon you yourself emit. Asking that question helps us ask larger questions about anyway, that's not even the right. Okay. Carbon footprint. So how cities are laid out and how they're designed over time affects your own lifestyle and how much driving, for example, you need to do. And so I was trying to make the case that studying cities and how they develop is a very relevant question to the next one, chapter 20, which is what are the global problems we're facing in terms of environmental problems and population problems at the global level. And if we're going to solve those population problems and global problems, environmental problems at the global level, we're probably going to have to look at cities and how they are designed. And more people are living in cities, so we better start thinking about how they're designed and how to get people to have lifestyles that are not harming the planet. And so we talked about how China has the largest total carbon footprint, because they have 1 billion people. So having lots of people is one way to have a big carbon footprint. But our country has the largest per capita footprint. So each per capita means per person. So we only have 300 million in our country. That's 1/3 of what China has. And yet we have almost the same total output of carbon. So their overall footprint's a little bigger than ours, but ours is close to theirs, but we have only 1/3 of the people. So that's another sign that our own lifestyles are out of proportion to much of the rest of the planet. Other people aren't contributing as much as we Americans. And so that's again why it's a good idea to ask, how have we designed our lifestyle so that it makes us such polluters? Because a lot of us don't want to be. When I asked you, do you hate planet Earth? You said no. So you'd probably, if you had a choice, want to be somebody whose lifestyle isn't harming the planet 3 times more than a Chinese person's lifestyle is harming the planet. But how do we do that? Well, we were trying to show that smart growth is a good way to do that. Non-smart growth is what led to Los Angeles. I don't know where this keeps coming from, or how to get rid of it. I think what I needed to do was, so weird. I think I need to download the study guide so that it doesn't. There we go. Now it won't be. So we talked about how the design of cities can do that, like having things so spread out, having your housing far away from your jobs or from your shopping. We talked about big box stores a little bit. I didn't today, but here again, forgetting about LA for a second. If you just think about your lifestyle here in the Yuba Sutter, how much shopping do you do that's far away from where you live? I think a lot of people tend to go out to the big box stores in Yuba City, for example, even if they live in Marysville. And how much do you go to Sacramento for your entertainment and things like that? I mean, again, and Plumas Lake was another example I used. So it's things, like that, how, the mismatch between jobs and housing and schools and all that stuff. All right, and what is a megalopolis? We said it's a city of cities. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you like movies, but Francis Ford Coppola, one of the great film directors who directed like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. His newest movie that he just showed at the big film festival they have in France called the Cannes Film Festival is called Megalopolis. Apparently it's a very strange movie and none of the American film companies wanted to pay to distribute it because they don't think anyone's going to watch it. I know I would be interested in it because if it's called Megalopolis and it's about society in the future, that's what sociologists really like. And anyway, but megalopolis is a city of cities, and as we talked about, the bigger our cities become and the less that we have, because we didn't pursue smart growth in the past, a lot of cities just merged into each other and they become one big city, one city of cities. And that happened in LA, but it's also happening somewhat in this Bay Area megalopolis. So the more that the lifestyle of the Bay Area spreads out horizontally, housing, for example, around San Francisco is so high, the cost, that if people want to buy their own home, they're moving east. So people are like buying homes in Stockton and Yuba City so they can go work in San Francisco. But that's a very sprawled out lifestyle. And that means, and it means that we're starting to just be one big region. And if we want that region to work, we probably don't want people driving their cars everywhere. We probably want more public transportation, like light rail that can carry people from Plumas Lake to Sacramento, and other transportation options that can carry you all the way to San Francisco. The governor wants to build something called the bullet train, a big high-speed magnetic levitation train that goes from here, from Sacramento area, and goes from San Francisco through Sacramento down to LA, so that all of California would have another public transit option that would be greener. In other words, those maglev trains don't produce the same emissions as diesel trains, and they can get you there quicker, so people would fly planes less, hopefully. And so that's the idea of the bullet train. But again, a lot of opposition. If the cost of it is so high that a lot of people are resisting that, and I don't know if that's the smartest, best way. There's a lot of other public transit options that we could maybe be pursuing. One thing the Sprawl to the Wall article didn't contemplate and is now possible is, electric cars actually make it possible to have this car-dependent lifestyle, but that doesn't cause a lot of the problems with smog and pollution and global warming. And but so far those are still private and most people can't afford them, and people aren't buying them, and if they're not buying them, then they're not going to sell them. And so but again, from a smart growth perspective, it would be smart if cities, for example, just provided free electric cars in the city the way they do with scooters sometimes and bikes. You just walk up to it, get in, credit card, and you just drive it to the next thing. And if everybody didn't own their own electric cars, they were just things you just temporarily use to get one from one place to another, that would probably be a lot cleaner and a lot healthier. And then a lot of people would have a lot more money left over in their lives if you're not spending it on insurance and gas and you're spending it on other stuff. Anyway, what is suburbanization? What factors led to the growth of suburbs in Los Angeles? So here, this was a general process that not just LA, but all of American cities have experienced it. And it was that movement out of the main cities, the core cities, into the virgin land outside the cities. So a lot of cities saw kind of sprawling away from their core downtown area out into the countryside and the farmland side, farmland. And all of that, what were the reasons? Well, we talked about economic factors, cultural factors, and social factors. Economically, the federal government really promoted this idea that everybody should want to have their own home. And it was part of the post-World War II plan for America to have a consumer economy where everybody gets to own a piece of America and wants to buy things to put in their piece of America. And that did create a very strong post-World War II economy that we've talked about already in this class. But the federal government gave home loans, federal subsidized home loans, so to help people buy these homes. Because if you had just left it up to the capitalism, to the marketplace, most people would have never been able to afford their own homes. But the federal government made it possible for people to buy homes. But there were some unintended consequences of that, like it mainly helped white people, it didn't help non-white people get homes. And we're still dealing with the effects of that. Cultural factors, so in order to get people to want to live in the suburbs, a whole new lifestyle was promoted, the suburban lifestyle of living in your own house, with your own single-family home, with no neighbors above you, no neighbors below you, neighbors far away from you on either side, so that you can have total privacy, and you can, again, part of this organization of the American family as private, and that you would want to buy a bunch of things for that piece of land. And so how is it promoted culturally? Well, TV shows, for example, promoted the suburban lifestyle and this single family lifestyle of like Father Knows Best and I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. And TVs themselves were part of this new suburban lifestyle of you don't need the city with its movie shows and its theater shows. You just need a box in your living room and you can get all the cool culture out there. And so that little box was also telling you the best place to live is out in the suburbs with the other people with boxes. So cultural, this new definition of the good life is how we put it, the suburban lifestyle rather than the urban lifestyle. By the way, I think right now is the time the country's leaders are trying to entice people back to cities in a way and try to re-emphasize the idea that suburban lifestyle has a lot of problems with it, and the more urban lifestyle where you don't have to own your own car, where you can walk to things, where all the exciting things are, like theater and live sports and live music, you should want that instead of just going to barbecues at your neighbor's house. So I don't know if you detect that, but I see it in a lot of advertising, and especially cities are consciously trying to get young people, especially these millennials and Gen Y, to say, you don't want what the previous generations wanted. They all wanted to live out in the suburbs in their own home, but you guys are smarter, you're younger, you're more technological, you're more hip. You want this new lifestyle that's greener and walkable and less owning. Instead of owning everything, you just temporarily rent a bike or a scooter or a car or a home. And maybe that is a smarter lifestyle given how few resources we have on planet Earth and how many people we have. Maybe that temporary light approach to not a heavy footprint land and I live here in my big house on it, but kind of lighter approach to living is probably a better one for the planet. So economic factors, cultural factors, the social factors was the third one. We mentioned white flight. White people were wanting to leave the cities for various reasons, and the federal government was encouraging them and giving them loans to do so. And a lot of non-white people were moving into American cities at the same time that the suburbs were growing outside of the cities. I was just hearing an interview with Michael McDonald, the guy that's sang with the Doobie Brothers and stuff like that. I don't know if you know him, but he was talking about he grew up in Ferguson, Missouri. And Ferguson is where that whole race issue went down a few years ago with the, I'm forgetting his name, not Rodney King, but the guy who couldn't breathe, and the cops or killed the guy in the streets, and then and the body lay there in the streets, and then there was riots about it. And Ferguson's outside St. Louis, and he was saying on this show, my family moved there as part of white flight. He used that term, like people were leaving St. Louis in the 50s and wanting to go live in the suburbs in the mainly all white communities out there. And he himself, as a young man growing up there, felt more sympathy with other young people in the big city. So if you've ever listened to Doobie Brothers, they have songs about like taking it to the streets and stuff like that, singing about poor non-white people in the cities. And anyway, so that was the third reason. Social reasons is that neighborhoods were changing in the cities. They were getting filled with immigrant groups like Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, black people from the South, and white people were leaving. Then finally, what is urban sprawl, and what are the smart growth principles that are meant to avoid and reduce urban sprawl? Well, we just talked about those. Things like compact development, so keeping housing and shopping and everything together all close together. And mixed use development is what allows that. So mixed use development is another smart growth principle. Regional planning, so thinking more in terms of a whole region, not just a particular city, but the whole region that it's part of is part of the smart growth. And transit-oriented development, thinking of ways to get people to have different public transit options so that they're not always getting in a car to go places. And we might also mention, I didn't just now, but housing options, having more single family, having more apartments and duplexes and other things besides just the single family home. I mean, with the whole homelessness problem now, cities are really starting to think about the mix of housing they do or don't have. They've even been converting old motels into temporary housing for homeless people. Anyway, so that's answered all the questions, I think, on our study guide. So hopefully you're ready for the exam. If you still have questions between now and Friday night when you have to take it, I can answer them on email. I'm going to post this. There's another, if you go into the module on Canvas to take the test, I just realized I better make sure it's not only linked to that module. But anyway, inside that module is another review session if you wanted to watch that. So it's filmed at a different time, but it covers a lot of the same questions. So, and then there's tutoring available too. So you'd have to contact College Success Center for that. All right, any questions before I let you go?
Was there an essay question on this one?
There is one essay question, but as I was saying, it's if you answer it at all, you're going to get the full 10 points. So just don't skip it. Just answer something. And I think you'll see that it's one you know how to answer. There is no right answer, so just answer.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, see you, and nice having you in class, and hope to see you around.
Do we have class Thursday?
Nope.
Why not?
So it's finals week now, so all the last thing is to take your exam.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too, take care.
You too.
Be safe.
You have a good summer.
You too. If you guys get a chance, come see that play on June 6th through the 8th. All right, take care.
Yeah, later.
Later.
They're just choosing to ignore me. It's just so, yeah, I'm so unprofessional because I got mad as an administrator. You know how unprofessional it is to just totally ignore the PhD professors that teach the students of your district? You know that? You just think it's cool? Go, "Oh, I got more important things than professors." Okay then, well, I got more important things than making sure that students are well taught here.